Avery, you know Alaska, don't you?
I do know Alaska.
It's hardcore. Portland is almost a suburb of
Welcome to Denver Startup Week. I'm Tammy Dorr, President and CEO of the Downtown Denver Partnership and co-chair of Denver Startup Week. This year marks the 10-year anniversary of Denver Startup Week. DSW has been the catalyst for lots of change over the past decade. And this week, we're coming together to celebrate the past and dream big for the future. We are able to bring Denver Startup Week to this community thanks to our 2021 sponsors. Thank you to our HQ and title sponsor, Amazon, and our title sponsors whose leadership makes this week come to life. Capital One Cafe, Downtown Denver Partnership, Fluid Truck, Hotel Engine, and WeWork. And our track sponsors who have made all of the great content you're hearing today possible, our founder track sponsor, Kickstart, growth track sponsor, Friday Health Plans, developer track sponsor, Quizlet, product track sponsor, Palantir, our designer track sponsor, Battery 621, and the Public Works. People track sponsor, Exactly, and Spotlight event sponsor, Strat Labs. Our headline event sponsors are bringing the excitement to the week. Thank you to B-Side Fund, Colorado Public Radio, Comcast, Coors Brewing, Denver Pavilions, Entrepreneurship at the University of Denver, JP Morgan Chase, Method, Moss Adams, Pi Insurance, Promontory Mortgage, Path, Southwest, Tattered Cover, and VF Venture Foundry. Finally, thank you to our partner and member sponsors, all listed on the screen. Please say thank you to these companies as you enjoy our hybrid Denver Startup Week. And don't forget, use the hashtag Den Startup Week to share your experiences and moments of inspiration on social media. Have a great week.
I'm Jimmy Eberhard. I'm the founder and CEO of Fluid Truck. Fluid Truck is growing rapidly. We're currently the fastest growing company in Colorado. We're going out there and transforming huge problems in fleets and deliveries and really providing a platform that gives anybody access to the right vehicle when they need it. Fluid's culture is a really unique one. It's a place where you get the opportunity to challenge, and I kind of look at it as like it's a choose your own adventure book. You step in, we're going to push the challenges, stuff that we're not even sure is possible, but we're going to go out there and try to build it. And it's amazing to watch people that have stepped inside of us, in the last year and now coming in and building, growing, leading teams. We're a testing ground and a proving ground. It's going to build some of the next technology leaders for the next generation. I love Denver Startup Week. I love people that are out there building, creating, starting companies, taking a chance and saying, hey, I've got this idea. Let's give it a go. And so just taking the challenge and going out and trying. That's what Denver Startup Week is all about. Fluid Truck is in a rapid scale mode. We've launched 27 markets this year already, and we're continuing to expand out and build across the US. For anybody that's ambitious, that's going out there and wants to change the world, come join us. We're out there building big stuff, and we need people that want to come lead, challenge, and go out there and transform the industry.
Thank you for being here, and thank you for being here with us virtually. I'm Avery Lill. I'm a host of Colorado Matters. That's a daily interview show from Colorado Public Radio. And our guest is David Brancaccio. He's host of Marketplace Morning Report from American Public Media. We're talking about robots and automation in the workplace. David, I was thinking about the first robot that I ever really got excited or engaged with, and it was this robotic dog. I think it was called Techno the Robotic Dog. And I was in elementary school, and it was able to, I think it was billed as having 160 emotions, and you could teach it how to play fetch, and you could teach it how to sit. It didn't come knowing those things. And something about the idea that it had sensors and could engage with me was so much more interesting than the woody pull string that could say there's a snake in my boot. So I'm curious about robots and why we are so engaged with them and why they shape our lives so much. So before we talk about that, you've met a lot of robots.
I've met some robots professionally. Did a couple of projects that I'll talk about that I was that required me to spend time with robots, including at Carnegie Mellon, a snake robot that crawls through sewers looking for problems. And it lashed around my lower leg up to my thigh and started to crush it. It was a really intense robot, but cool, definitely cool. That robot dog might have been a different serial number I had. That might have been my one companion for my first trip across the country for that project that we're going to talk about called Robots Ate My Job. I didn't go with any. The idea was I wanted to talk about automation in America. We tend to interact increasingly with machines, but did it get to the point, and I did this in 2012, where you could drive from the Atlantic to the Pacific? That's like a 5-6 day journey and never interact with a human. And we would use that to tie together a discussion of the bigger issue for my public radio listeners, which is, what are the opportunities that this technology is bringing to the workplace, but what are also the challenges? To what extent is it disrupting the labor force? And so I got a car magazine to give me a much better car than I could ever get access to. It wasn't robotic. It was 2012. It had some minor robotic features. It had adaptive cruise control back then and a few other things. But I brought this silver dog. Was your dog silver?
You know, I never actually got the dog. We got a real dog around that time.
Oh, so they said don't do it.
You tell me, how was the dog as a companion? Because I never found out.
It's still in the New York Bureau. I might ship it to you. Put in some batteries. You can finally requite.
Oh, my childhood dreams.
Your childhood dreams can be fulfilled. But first of all, I'm so glad to be here. I'm so glad to be working with CPR. I'm so glad to be back in Denver. You're the first humans I have seen in 19 months. The New York Bureau, where I have my broadcast studio for my show, has been closed since March. I had to fly down to Florida to meet some public radio listeners there in the middle of March, on the 11th of March, 2020. And I said, I'm happy to come. I see what's going on in the world, but I don't want to cancel the event. But just don't get me on the plane, and then when I land, tell me the gig is canceled. Well, you know what happened. And the rest is history. But yeah, it's somehow different still to connect. But if you're watching virtually, it ain't bad. And I'm glad to meet you this way as well. The thing is that these days, we're trying to figure out, like many businesses, how we can reopen our facilities in our newsroom. CPR is more further down the curve than we are at Marketplace. But so right now I go in a couple times a week to a completely empty studio, and I'm like Matt Damon in The Martian. And yeah, exactly. And what am I fertilizing it with, right? But here's the thing, and this is what ties my comment about where I'm doing my job right now with the robot trip. Right now, my audio technician is in Los Angeles, downtown. My director is in North Hollywood, California. My producer is in Astoria, Queens, New York. My reporter might be in Silver Spring, Maryland, or Austin, Texas, or Clovis, California, depending on the particular week. So the fact is, that is how we've been doing the show for years. Normally I have a producer with me, and occasionally I see some of the reporters, but we have been distributed because technology allows this for many years. So when I went on this attempt to drive across the country to interrogate this notion of, are robots, we know robots are a disruptive force, but are they ultimately aggregate in the end an opportunity? Or are we going to run out of jobs? The question I put to myself, and also some of the listeners are asking me, how alienating is it to cross the country where you can never see any people? You know, a lot of my interaction was with a Google map on the screen, not with people. There are certain things you can't do if you're behind the wheel with the vow not to meet a human. You can't have barbecue at Rendezvous in Memphis. I was like right there, and I had vowed not to meet a person, and they didn't have a vending machine. So I couldn't. So I ate that day on the banks of the Mississippi with the robot dog, a frozen pizza that I had bought with self-checkout cooked on the engine block of that car. It doesn't work as well as they say, by the way. It's a little limp, this here pizza. But here was the thing, 6 days, it's as close as I'll ever get to an interplanetary type mission. By the way, NASA uses psychological batteries of tests to figure out if crews will work together. The Russians have it, or it's more clever. They stick potential crews into a car and have them drive to Siberia. And if they don't murder each other, by the time they get there, they're like, okay, this is compatible. So being in the car can be an important way of galvanizing it, like figuring out who you're dealing with. Driving alone for 6 days was like my normal day. I've been in training for this for years. How often do we really interact now? We're often texting anyway. We're often, at the time, Skype, now Zoom. Days go by without me seeing more than a person or two. And I don't know if that is how I want to live my life in perpetuity, but in a weird way, it helped those of us who had occupations where we could socially distance. It helped prepare us for what happened during technology was ready for many of us in that situation. By the way, I blew it 2.5 times on that journey.
What were the 2 times?
So the idea was to not interact with people. So number one lesson, if that's your goal, is don't travel with a cute robot dog. Everybody wants to talk to you. So what you need to really do is not have a cute robot dog, have a baseball cap on and put in earbuds and look down. No one will talk to you. I didn't have the heart. So people wanted to talk to me, but I sort of moved on. But pulling into, in Roanoke, Virginia, I went to get the food at a grocery and I was going to do the self-checkout, never have an economic interaction with a human. And self-checkouts, you've done them. They're impossible to do just by yourself. The machines never work. The bananas wouldn't scan. There's a helpful person who wanted to help me. And there's a really funny video, because I was recording video, of me running away from the person trying to help me. So I escaped that one, but then I rolled into Albuquerque. No, it was somewhere in Oklahoma at midnight. And I picked hotels where you could swipe to get in. There were robot check-in clerks. And the night manager had spotted my name in the computer and was a listener and just wanted to meet me. And I'm like, what am I going to do? I'm sorry, I'm not talking to the little people today. I mean, come on. So I declared that on the air. And the other place where I didn't blow it with people, but I blew it with technology, I had produced this. Look, I was the person figuring out the journalism of this, not just narrating it, which in television, it's often the haircut with a real journalist doing all the hard work. But in this case, I was setting it up. And I had Easy Pass from back east for the bridges. And I got all the way across the country, and I was 35 minutes from the goal, which was Ocean Beach in San Francisco. Had to get there for sundown because otherwise I wouldn't get good video. The Bay Bridge is not Easy Pass. So I ran the toll. It's on tape. And some listener wrote saying, that's just cheating. That's like your strategy for getting food was to climb in a window and steal it. And fair enough, fair enough. But in the end, I had to get there for bad planning on my part. But the fuel for that journey that led to what you might consider people in the room here for Startup Denver might find more useful for your thinking is the follow-up journey that I did. That was not called Robots Ate My Job. That was called Robot-Proof Jobs. And you know, if you talk to many mainstream economists for many years, they would say, yeah, I know, technology is disruptive, but in the end, more and better jobs accrue. Technology destroyed 98% of agriculture jobs in America. But those are backbreaking jobs in the sun and dangerous. And ultimately, you had the Industrial Revolution where people had hard jobs, but not as hard as agriculture. And productivity was increased by the technology, and society had benefits. So what economists tend to tell you is stop worrying about the robots. And by robots, I don't just mean robots like our dog. I also mean automation. I'm talking about software. I'm talking about digitization. What got my attention was some work out of MIT, among other places, that showed that there's a possibility, there's a scenario, not necessarily our definite destiny, that ultimately fewer jobs are created in the future to make up for the ones that are lost. And nobody I talked to ever made the case that it's not highly disruptive. The following few decades with enormous turnover of jobs, in part because of technology and accelerated by pandemic, you and I should talk about that, will force many more people to change not jobs, which will always happen, but to change occupations. And that's going to make some people mad. It's also going to make some people super happy because it's an enormous opportunity. And the people in this room thinking about technology and actual technologists have an enormous opportunity here. But it's also something we have to think about as citizens, and people have to think about as who are interested in public policy. because a mad, angry population, because of all the disruption, is not a happy place, and it can alter our politics in destructive ways. So I've been doing a lot of thinking about that.
So with your road trip automation, it is iterative, just like the ways that we learn to use technology are iterative. You didn't wake up one day and find yourself in a road trip that was completely unlike anything that you had ever done before. You've been building to it. And in the same way, automation has been with us. It's not new. We learned to use washing machines and dishwashers, and that completely changed the way that access to the workforce for many people. I'm curious about what's different about robots and automation now that's so much more disruptive than they were 100 years ago, say.
It's a great question. By the way, just a side note on washers and dryers. When they were introduced, they were going to liberate in that society the housewife, because you wouldn't have all this drudgery. All that happened is that people's requirements for clean clothes went up. And you should look at those studies. Now we can never wear something twice, and it didn't help that much. It helps some. I mean, for heaven's sakes. Who here has used a mangle, the device to squeeze the...
We don't have wash day anymore.
We don't have wash day anymore. What's different now is a bunch of things, including the pace of technological innovation is way faster than we thought it would be. The technology can do stuff we never thought it could do, and it can also take over tasks we never thought was possible. We used to think that the manual labor jobs are the ones most vulnerable to technology. What some really interesting research by McKinsey Global Institute, which is a side institute, it's not the consulting firm per se, but it's allied with it. We relied a lot on their research for some of our reporting. They think that, what was the percentage? Half of everything everybody does is potentially automatable. And that figure would not have been that high 5 years ago and 10 years ago. It represents, they found, $16 trillion in wages. And don't miss the point that it's not like just a certain occupation is going to disappear, and if you don't have the cursed occupation, you're okay. It's bits and pieces of all of us are automatable. A really important question to ask, though, and the McKinsey people do this. I'm grabbing my phone to do something. Is that an important point? Is that automatable doesn't mean it will be automated. It may be too expensive, or just silly, or not socially acceptable. There is a study of the legal system, judges happen to be in Israel, and they found that judges' decisions are greatly influenced by time of day and how close they are to having had a meal, or if they're getting hangry. Their sentences are tougher when they're hungry. So that means human judges, in a sense, are very fallible. And there is some AI that has shown in a test in Europe that's been pretty effective at predicting. It looked at retrospectively at cases. The AI tried to come up with what its judgment would be. And it's not perfect, but it's spookily not bad at coming up with the same kind of thing. So let's say we'll turn judges into software. That's going to be a long road to sell to human beings, right? That's not the first place they're going to automate. So there's all those things holding automation back. But then came pandemic. And if my reporting, robots ate my job, and then 5 years later, robot-proof jobs, and we should talk about the proof ones, that predated pandemic. But the latest models that smart people are trying to use to think about some of these things finds that pandemic has increased by 28% the pace of automation. And things we never thought would switch earlier have been switched because of the new factor placed in there of, we're not so sure we want people face-to-face as often in certain occupations. So there's now a premium on technology. And Nobel Prize for Economics is Monday. So we're such nerds at Marketplace. Oh my gosh. We have a little pool going. There's no real short list. They would say it's a short list, not a real short list. It's just people guessing. So I think it's this famous economist out of MIT called Duran Acemoglu. And he says, among many other things, that recessions always bring about a burst in turning to technology by business. And it sticks. It sticks. So you can take that notion of, if you enter hard times, and that there's a greater push to technology, a greater push toward you being able to get the market to accept what it is people in this room are trying to place in the market. The pandemic is going to be that on steroids. So major disruption, but again, there are plenty of scenarios that in the end we end up with better jobs that are more productive. We couldn't figure out why technology wasn't increasing our productivity for all these years. It was the weird mystery that was happening, and we kept reporting on it. And I would call famous economists, and they would go, the Italians have this shrug. It's like, goes like this, buh, and it means, I don't know. And I'd say, how come productivity is going up? We're all buying computers and we got the internet, buh. Now it's happening, productivity is going up. So it's starting to take hold. But robot-proof jobs is an interesting question. It's not often what you think. It turns out, Avery and I were talking,
yeah.
Tree pruner is pretty resistant. Although there is a startup here in Denver that does electrified care of greenery, I noticed, which is cool. But I assume it's the more regular landscapes. But trees are custom. That's why we love our trees. And they're funky. And apparently it's been judged by people smarter than me that that's not going to be the first place that automation is going to come. But all right, how about the poor person who spent all those years going through college, into medical school, residency to be a radiologist? That's vulnerable. It means doesn't mean there's not going to be any radiologists in this world. There'll be some very happy radiologists because using technology, they're going to be really productive. But the number of radiologists is going to go down because the machines will be able to go through more routine cases, pathologists and stuff, same kind of thing. So stuff where people got some pretty good invested in what should be highly compensated, skilled work may find that those are not necessarily the jobs of the future. I'm lucky that I'm in one of these places that there ain't going to be any nasty robots taking my job, except, hey Siri, what's the Dow Jones Industrial Average?
Dow Jones Industrial Average was up 0.98% today, trading at 34,754.
That's not my job, but it's a piece of my job. There are people, I don't know if there's anybody in the room, who come for the silly stock market indicators to know if the world has come to an end, and stay for the workplace culture and innovation stories that hopefully we're doing. But there is an AI that's been writing corporate earnings narratives in Forbes magazine, Forbes, I think it is, for years now, with a company called Narrative Sciences. It's not bad. I mean, you always would have given that, unless it was like Enron going down the tubes 20 years ago. You gave that to grown-up reporters, but it would be the entry-level people writing the earnings, the meat and potato stuff. And this thing does an okay thing. Sports reporting, high school level, great sports reporting is nothing that a robot could do. But run-of-the-mill stuff, there's a Tampa paper, let me not put it there right next to the microphone. Tampa Papers had an AI doing police blotter coverage for 15 years. 800 occupations were classified by the McKinsey people as to automatable potential. And I had to go through, and there's some ones that are just clear, and we featured them in some of our reporting. And since we did it, I haven't seen another one. Toll booth person. I mean, it's just, we talked to some toll booth people. I mean, it's got to be the worst job in the world. But the fact is, when I talk to people at the Jersey Turnpike, and where was it in Ohio, they were just taking out the human toll booths when we were in Ohio. Some people whose lives are not defined by their work, who define their lives in a different way, caregiver for another relative, or they're an artist, but they needed work that just brought in some money and had some benefits. They were sad that job is going away to technology. On the outside looking in, you're like, it's got to be the worst job, especially during COVID, people breathing on you and you giving them change, but it's not for often us to say. But what is the least robotizable, safest, robot-proof job in America? And I've been waiting to tell you this. That's why I came out here. Given what the prompt is, Startup Denver. A very non-robotizable job is CEO. And McKinsey found that, a leader. But I would prefer, and this is what we identified on the air, entrepreneur is not automatable. Because you're looking for corners in the market that are not fulfilled by the paradigms that we're thinking. And the way that a AI would work is you would give it a paradigm. And also entrepreneurs are agile. And so we talk to entrepreneurs as part of the series. It's just, you can just rest assured a robot will not do that sort of work because it's highly creative. You're like composers in the business world, in a sense. And that is, by the way, another area that McKinsey identified. Composers is pretty safe. And we talked to an electronic music composer at Oberlin College for the series. And I asked him, yeah, but you're training students to be composers? How many jobs are there? And he said, with technology, way more, because a lot of the explosion of multimedia now requires music. I said, but computers can compose. You know, I played some, and he said, and listen to it. It's awful. It was awful. There's AI that wrote a short story and wrote a play. It's cute. It's not. They performed it, and it was sort of like maybe it was Dadaist, weird, surrealist wackiness, but it's not something you're going to pay big ticket. It wasn't Hamilton, was it? But it's and then to really bring it home, hopefully for you, of entrepreneurs, what are the sort of entrepreneurs? I was trying to pick one that would really be emblematic of robot proof. And that would be a robot entrepreneur, a person who develops robots. And so I was looking at the list of startups just in this area, and it's a giant list, and I can't possibly name them all. You wouldn't want me to, but what a hotbed you have here. AG Robots, no, what is it called? Ag Robots Tortuga does agricultural robots. Pattern Labs does customized robots. Scythe Robots. It sounds a little scary. I don't want a robot with a large curved blade, but Scythe Robotics is the one that does the green spaces. Watchtower Robotics does safer water systems robots. This might be those robots of the sort I saw that could examine infrastructure. It goes on. There's even a Sphero apparently does robotics that have humanity and personality. I could use a little more of that in my newsroom. But it's you're involved in a creative field. You're like poets, but using a different sort of canvas, which is taking lots of information and helping people see the world in a different way, the way you do, to meet a need that is unmet. And that's I get the most energy from designers and entrepreneurs when I can actually meet human beings. Graphic designers are, that's a different conference that we can do sometime, but some enlightened companies invite designers to have a seat on the board because of their superpower to look at the world in a different place and communicate in a different way. But entrepreneurs share that in a way.
Tell me about what you found in the ways that automation has changed since the pandemic, and specifically the kinds of jobs that have changed the most that maybe we wouldn't have seen changing so quickly or in that direction.
I was so hoping you were going to ask me something like that. And we didn't rig all this up in advance. We talked casually about what we would talk about. I've looked at the figures, and in 2020, the first pandemic year, 4.4 million new enterprises were started in America, and that's up 24% from 2019. So cynics among you are like, well, sole proprietorships, nothing wrong with that, but that's not going to be a great engine of employment. The Census Bureau later came out with data that showed that how many percentage? I think it was 16% of the new startups in 2020 are in a category of likely to employ people. And so that's, there's nothing wrong with being a sole proprietor. I am one, I have a company. But if you're thinking about jobs of the future that will build on themselves, it's these other companies. And that's a lot of people who were able to be lucky enough to save a little bit because of how the pandemic, its effects were distributed so unequally. Took the opportunity to try to start enterprises. And it's really interesting to see of those entrepreneurs, when you look at breakdowns by race, a lot of people of color started businesses in the first pandemic year. And that has the potential for some social change. But Avery and I were shocked when we shared an article about your question. The research was done for the National Bureau of Economic Research. It happens to be done out of Canada, but it's about the US. It took a look at occupations across America that were vulnerable to you getting COVID. And you know which ones some of those are, right? Retail was medium risk. Working in a factory with the processes meat is very high risk. Dental hygienist is a nightmare, really is, on that point. So they said, okay, what's vulnerable? And then they mapped it across what's automatable. So what's got the double whammy of vulnerability? And they did it by like county. Coloradans, the overall risk of the double whammy is not that high in Colorado. There are hot spots for being where industries are centered where COVID risk is higher. But the automatable jobs, it's not that much of a hotbed for that. Part of it is the knowledge economy that you've developed here, which is nice that it's robust like this. But where we were talking, that it just, I wanted you to know this, it stopped me on my tracks and it ignited some really, a conversation in our newsroom about coverage. There's it's hugely gendered. The most vulnerable jobs, double the amount of vulnerable jobs are held by women. Now, because women have a lot of those low wage jobs in which they're connected to people that also have a routine that could be automatable. And if you're thinking about issues of equity, it's something that you really have to absorb. I will tell you that in a lot of the country, and certainly it was the case in Colorado, that this effect is for people who don't have college degrees. If you have less than a college degree, that's where you see this. For people with BAs, the gender disparity disappears. There isn't a gender disparity in the double whammy vulnerability, automation and COVID. In Colorado, you just like for people with college educations. But isn't that the problem with America? Is that and it's certainly the problem with pandemic, it's distributed so unequally. I was working in a job where we could rethink of it and we had practice doing it remotely and we were able to move equipment around and put the equipment into people's homes and keep doing a lot of what we do. there were some costs. I was talking to the CPR newsroom today, and they were able to do incredibly heroic work, keeping people engaged with public issues during pandemic at a time when you really had to. But we miss the one-on-one of our reporting, and that's not just it's not just the icing on the cake, being able to meet people one-on-one. The best stuff is what stuff you didn't know in advance, but that you trip over when you're talking to this person, but this person says, hey, I have something to say. And it turns out that's the bigger story. And setting up Zoom meetings to talk to experts, which many of us did under the banner of journalism in the last year and a half, isn't quite the same. But I'm lucky, and hopefully people in this room were generally lucky in being able to pivot. Not many parts of the economy could not do that. And so the burdens of this have been distributed unequally. So most robot-proof job, entrepreneur, better still, I would say, robot entrepreneur. So I had talked to a budding robot entrepreneur who became an entrepreneur in the original series in 2012. He was a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh. When I caught up with him 5 years later, he had a robot company. He'd done a startup and he had employees. And it's called Hebi Robotics in Pittsburgh, Hebi. And so I contacted him the other night and I said, I'm going to Denver, and we were talking to people who are really engaged in thinking about entrepreneurship. How's it been going? And it would be cooler if he was here and Avery was doing the interview with Dave Rawlinson, young, aggressive entrepreneur. What he does is modular robotic actuators so that you can kind of build a robot from his parts that do what you want it to do, as opposed to leafing through a catalog to find something that's already dedicated to what you want it to do. And it's like Lego Mindstorms, but industrial. Last year was really hard, but with the PPP loans, he didn't lay off anybody, but it took the government intervention. He's grateful for those. Now, and it was hard, but they came out the other side. They're flush enough that they're opening a new headquarters in the coming weeks. He's hired 2 more engineers. It's probably a company that's got about 15 engineers, something like that. What's his problem now? It's your problem too. One part of it is pandemic. The pandemic distortions in the supply chain are nightmarish. But it's also an opportunity, and that's why it was so important that I talked to him knowing I was going to meet you. There is all this thinking about unglobalization right now. And as entrepreneurs here in the heartland, you're uniquely positioned to meet needs without, when people deal with you, they're not dealing with faraway places. But they're also seeking the ability to do industrial processes that allow for creative solutions when other bits of the supply chain fall through. He said, it's not just, he said, pandemic distortions generally for his business it's weird, but he used the word bonkers if it's connected to semiconductor stuff. It's just out of control. You just don't know when you get the stuff. So his customers are looking for ways that they can have, he thinks he's in a strong position with this modular approach, so that if this piece of the assembly line breaks down and a part's not coming for 9 months, back order from hell, Americans are really good at freestyling interesting approaches to problems. There's a famous article about how Silicon Valley really happened. And it's by Tom Wolfe, the famous author who wrote The Right Stuff. And it's a profile of the Fairchild Semiconductor guy who also created Intel. It's Robert Noyce. And he's from the heartland. He's from Iowa. He's from where Grinnell College is. And there are Congregationalists who didn't have much use for people who were just trading on being wealthy. That wasn't their big thing. Their big thing was, are you religious? but also, are you hardworking? And if you could show those things, you were respected in that society. But they had a lot, he points out that a lot of the people who went out to California in the first wave of microchip stuff were people from the Midwest, where there was a premium on your ability to solve problems in creative fashion, often mechanical problems, often people who had grown up on farms that had to fix stuff in situ. And that he argues, Tom Wolfe, a little unfairly, that among the elites with the posh ways of speaking in the East, the value was, besides money, working in academia on slightly impractical approaches to thinking about the problems of the world. And the other thing, of course, that article is famous for is its major focus is defection capital. They started working for William Shockley, the inventor of the junction transistor, and then he was sort of a jerk to them. And they all got up and said, we're starting our own company. You can't do that. That's a betrayal. You're Benedict Arnold. You'll never work again. Oh, yes, they worked again. And that's, of course, what happens now in our modern view of entrepreneurship. But the pandemic has, there's a study by the people who do the World Economic Forum, the people who do Davos, Switzerland, that gathering at the ski resort, in which the great and the good all show up every February it is, right? I think it's February, not January. And leading up in the couple years leading up into pandemic, from 2014 to 2019, 55% of businesses that they rigorously polled said that they were going to be investing in the coming years in new technology to speed up their processes and automation. And when they asked recently, it's 75%. Now you're like, how could anyone have answered no before pandemic? But the fact is, a lot of businesses did say, well, we've got the computers we need and we'll upgrade to Windows 11 when that happens. But they weren't thinking bigger. And with pandemic, it's like everywhere. And so you're going to see this big surge. So as engaged members of society, in addition to being people who are thinking about their good ideas to make the society better through your own enterprises, this is a big conversation that we need to be having about how we're going to reskill people and upskill people for these jobs, because they're going to be mad if they're sitting around. When we did robot-proof jobs, we also talked about ways of mitigating the effects of the disruption. And there was this crazy, wild fringe idea that we engaged. I would talk to audiences about it, and they're like, that's science fiction. Universal basic income, where you just hand money out to people. And pandemic came and we had one. We had one. We handed money out to people. And it kind of worked. Like wild stuff. So the series we did last summer, Locked Down, for public radio, was reimagining the economy, which is, we saw that the pandemic was widening the range of public policy options. Things that were off the table were now not so wacky. And so what are some of those ideas? And we shared some of them. These would be structural changes to the economy. And we're at the point where I should be getting your questions, but one question I would put to you is, it's always a mystery to me, and we are the most entrepreneurial country. Sweden, you'd think they'd be pretty entrepreneurial. It was so un-entrepreneurial that they brought in the king of Sweden to pitch the idea of it's okay to be an entrepreneur. And I was reading an article about this. The deal was this: with entrepreneurship means failure too, right? A lot of stuff doesn't work. In Sweden, apparently, if you had an enterprise that went belly up, you were done. You were not marriageable. You could not find a mate. Her family or his family would ostracize you. It was a cultural problem. Now in Silicon Valley, right? You're not, and in entrepreneurial circles like this, you may need to make your bones by failing a few times. It's part of the the creative destruction that you engage in. But one barrier to this is healthcare reform. Imagine the absolute cascade of people who would want to try stuff if it wasn't for being stuck at the job for the benefits. And it's odd that we have this duality in America. A lot of entrepreneurship and willingness to try some of this. It's also geographical. I forgot to mention this. Geographical. Rilof Botha, the South African venture capitalist who's in Silicon Valley now, he was in early with Instagram and YouTube. He says he's been giving money to many more startups outside Silicon Valley since pandemic. He hasn't given up on Silicon Valley, but that the remote thinking that's gone in, that has been our response, that place doesn't matter. What a woman who was a writer for The Economist magazine wrote a book 1,000 years ago called The Death of Distance finally happened. Should we take some questions?
We are ready to take some questions. We'll have questions from folks in the room as well as questions from folks online that you can leave in the comments. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you.
Here comes a mic. Tell us your name. Hi.
Hi, my name is Linda Klein. And I was wondering, what do you know about the future of elder care and robots? My husband and I don't have kids, and we're sort of maybe banking on a little bit of care from robots. Is that misguided?
I'm so glad. That's the greatest question because there's a three-part thing that it raises. Let me be brief about all. So the Japanese have been really focused on this because of their aging population for decades. And so the humanoid robots are coming out of Japan, in part to deal with this. We all in this room know about the uncanny valley. When you make a humanoid robot look too close to human, it gets creepy. There's that issue. But one of the most robot-proof human occupations that they still think will be a lot of opportunities for people is in caregiving. But there's a disconnect with how much those workers get paid. And that's a giant thing going on in the economy now, which is crucial work we desperately need people to do is hard and not remunerated well. So is technology going to come to the rescue? What you're probably worried about while you ask the question is this. The other thing that the heavy robotics guy, Dave Rawlinson, that I talked to the other night in preparation for seeing you, said to me, the non-pandemic effect he's seeing is there has been a reappraisal recently in how fast some of this really exotic technology is moving. He expressed it in terms of self-driving cars. We're going to have really cool cars that are safer and on major highways do a lot of the driving. But the idea that all these taxis in urban areas are going to be no person in them, we're reappraising that right now. Still a huge opportunity for people feeding that market. It's really interesting work. And then one wonders if in caregiving, how far we can go with this. I did an event with the makers of a movie. Maybe you saw it. It's with Frank Langella, and it's in the slightly not distant future, like a couple years ahead, where there's a older gentleman played by Frank Langella who doesn't have immediate family around, and he's given a caregiver robot, and he bonds with it too tightly with the possibility that he's excluding human interactions. By the way, I've done some speaking about ethics and technology and thought some about it. I'm not an expert. A little creepy, but just thought I'd put it on the table. An ethical issue is, do you want companion robots where there's gratification involved, he said, knowing we're live here? What if people are encouraged to fall in love with the machine? Is that right? But part three of what you raised, I haven't fully answered it. It's going to be a solution because it's a huge need, is what is going to propel automation and enormous advances and investment in the field that may mean, in fact, more and richer jobs are created rather than are destroyed versus are destroyed, are demographics. We're aging as a population. There's not enough people to do the work that's needed. It's possible that I've seen rigorous estimates that just because people will still be alive and thriving, but not working, that it's going to take every erg of human work potential to meet those needs by the people who aren't that age. So it may be the demographics is solving some of this problem, but there's a huge need. And in places like Germany, where the population is aging much more than here, and then different conference, we can do this, I'll come back. Think about the personal finance issue here. When you don't have enough people working and paying taxes to support those of us who've gone gray, the economics of the way we do retirement get out of whack. Other questions? Mike will come to you, sir, I think in a minute, but there's one in the back. Your name?
Hi, I'm Lydia McMahon. So I do Workforce of the Future as a job. And I think you kind of touched on reskilling, but the two barriers I see is individual motivation and academic partners. There's really not a lot of part-time programs for people to go to when they have a full-time job. And it's a little hard to convince people that things are changing sometimes when they're, busy taking care of families and working, and they really don't feel like they have space to take on schools. So I wonder what your research and reporting has found.
And then I want to ask you, wait, don't give up the mic yet, because I have a quick question to ask you too. Some of the problem of people being unwilling is a sense of betrayal from what's happened in the past. We have talked to people from our reporting who got reskilled. They worked in a machine shop, and then they entered a program that wasn't all that long, but still required time, which is the most precious resource. And then what they learned was already obsolete when they were done. So we have to demonstrate to people that it's apt type. They're getting the skills of the things of the future. And we were talking in the CPR newsroom today about one of the big, it's a real moment in which people are saying to themselves, the pandemic has forced them into this mindset where they're less willing to do crappy jobs. Drudge work, service sector, dangerous, unappreciated jobs for low pay. There are alternatives that pay a little more that are remote jobs. Insurance company that will let you process some of their data without you getting in the way of COVID, or just bosses being mean to you. And so there's competition. So people are rethinking. And so in that case, they may also be thinking, what do I do want to be doing and how should I get the chops necessary to do this? But I saw that in Australia, in the state of New South Wales, they had done a rigorous analysis of what are going to be the big jobs in their area 20 years from now. And coming here, I was like, gee, I should find out if Denver has done that. Have they?
I haven't seen anything. There was a future proof report that came out maybe like 3 years ago, and it really focused on more the human skills like communication, creativity, some of the things you were talking about, and then digital fluency, data literacy, things like that. So not specific jobs.
That's really good for like school kids, because you want to know the generic skills, because some of the jobs of the future have not been invented, right?
Right.
But Michigan has tried to figure out near term, next 10 years kind of thing, and then link the info with community colleges and trade schools so that you don't go in and get some wacky training in something that won't be useful. I don't know how fully effective it is, but I think the intention is really good.
Yes, hi, my name's Kevin Cheek. I'm wondering about the mismatch of people with skills looking for jobs and people needing to hire people. It's very hard for a lot of companies, restaurants, bars, et cetera, right now to staff up. I do know there are young people with college degrees and good skills that are having trouble finding jobs. How do you think that's, one, the result of the pandemic, of course, and the increase in innovation and automation? How is that going to play out, and how does that provide opportunities for everyone in this room?
Said last part again, opportunities for what?
Everyone here in this room.
Yeah.
To invent the new jobs and find places for folks.
Yeah, I mean, look, it is something that we're interrogating daily now, this weird moment where, I mean, the jobs report is tomorrow. I think it's going to be strong. I think kids went to school and the caregivers are up feeling a little freed up. I don't know if they rushed to get the jobs in September, because they're asking the question, what is a meaningful job? And maybe I can hold out for something better. So, but eventually people will get back into the workforce. But food service is an enormous opportunity. There's going to be, like at the airport, the touchscreens and food prep. I talked to a restaurateur in New York who had a not super high-end restaurant, but a nice restaurant. And he thinks that that category of not fast casual Chipotle, but not super fancy pants, 57th Street, stratospheric stuff. He thinks the whole classes of those restaurants are going out of business, because if you want to deal ethically with your employees, pay them reasonably enough to attract them also, give them, not overburden them with 60-hour weeks. Diners haven't figured out the fact that they're going to need to pay more for that yet, and that there's going to be a lot of disruption. But there, it is true that we're still hearing people are like, I can't find jobs. And I don't know if it's that people have fantasy jobs, like the greatest job in the world they're holding out for. It seems like there's a lot of interesting jobs that are there for the taking. And that old arguments about there's nothing out there, this is not the moment we're seeing this. But that's 75% of business executives who are in position to make the decisions about investment in technology saying they are going to bring on more technology in the coming few years is crazy opportunity for people in the room.
I want to make sure that we take one question from online. Do we have any? Okay, we actually don't have any, so
That's easy then.
it's all right. We've got more time for those in the room.
Patient person, tell us your name.
So Joseph Hecker, 2 parts on as far as people not flocking to those open jobs. Is this the effect of the gig economy where people are taking smaller jobs and not looking for those full-time jobs, and they've learned to adapt? Second is, you being public radio, traditionally the government has, prompted the electric car race. They put up, kind of propaganda, or just kind of encourage the country that we were going to get to the moon, and they encouraged the country that we were going to develop electric vehicles. I hear less propaganda. I hear less billboards and signage saying, hey, country entrepreneurs, suit up and go tackle this problem.
Let me pick up on that because we're right up against the clock. Great question. There's huge opportunity for industrial policy. The big infrastructure debate in Washington is in part bringing that to the energy side of this, but not only the energy side of this, also quantum computing. The government has enormous power to invest, create jobs in risky areas where they don't know if things are going to work out. But yeah, like where's the space program for for what you're talking about? And that requires loud, consistent leadership, but backed with money. And the money debate is what's going on in Washington right now.
That's going to be our last question. Is that right that we're running up on time? That is it. Thank you all so much for being here. David, thank you for sharing.
Of course, my pleasure. Great meeting everybody. So every night, in the middle of the night, I am connected with Fort Collins, Colorado from New Jersey. This watch tunes in the atomic clock, and there's a radio towers up there that do that. And because I had updated the watch, I knew that we had 25 seconds left. So you're not Fort Collins, but I think of you Coloradans on a daily basis when my watch connects with our network time in the studios. So I'm not going to flee. So if you have further questions, let's chat a little bit. I know, right?